Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for this virtual event today. My name is Jeffrey Wilson, and I'm the Research Director at the Perth USAsia Centre. Today, we're here to be launching the Perth USAsia Centre's newest policy report, which is entitled Beyond the Bilateral, Regional Value Chains and the Next Phase of Australia-Indonesia Economic Engagement. And despite our online modality, it's the custom of the Perth USAsia Centre to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which the centre is located, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and to also pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. We're very pleased there's been significant interest in our event today. Over 150 attendees on this call from right across Australia, Indonesia and indeed the broader region. And this report addresses what has been a key question for Australia-Indonesia relations that our centre has been seeking to advance for several years. How can the two countries develop economic relationship that's befitting their size in the region, their proximity to each other, and their declared ambitions? As many of the guests on this call will already know, the development of economic ties between Australia and Indonesia has lagged the broader upgrading of their bilateral relationship over the last decade. Direct bilateral trade and investment flows are simply not as high as our proximity would demand, or indeed what the ambition of our governments and our businesses have called for. And we argue that much of the challenge is due to the fact that Australia-Indonesia economic relationship is often framed strictly in bilateral terms, what we can do with each other and only each other. This is a problem because the areas in which each of our countries have economic strengths are not always complementary when a strictly bilateral frame is applied. And so in this report, Kyle Springer and Brian Kraft argue there's a need to regionalise how we view the economic opportunity between Australia and Indonesia. This approach instead looks to how the two countries could collaborate in broader economic networks, particularly partnerships within cross-border value chains that might exploit synergies that become available when a more regional perspective is adopted. It also continues a long tradition of Perth USAsia Centre advocacy about regional value chains, which complements some of our recent work you may have read on critical minerals and batteries. I'm very glad that you can all join us for the official launch of our newest policy report today. So let me introduce our speakers. First, you're going to hear from the two report authors. Kyle Springer, who's a policy fellow at the Centre and leads our programs in research on Southeast Asia. Brian Kraft, who's the principal consultant at Endeavour Environmental and has extensive in-country commercial experience in Indonesia. And this will be followed by some reflective and expanding comments from Alicia Salisto, who's one of the Centre's Indo-Pacific Fellows for 2021, but by day is also the Deputy Managing Director at Bauer Group Asia, a strategic consultancy group. Following their presentation, we're going to have time to take some of the questions that have been kindly submitted from many of the members of the audience here today. So with that, thanks very much for joining us, and we'll start the proceedings by turning over to Kyle Springer. Thanks, Kyle.
Thanks, everyone, and I'm really thrilled to have the opportunity to talk about our report today. But first, I want to acknowledge the challenging COVID-19 situation in Indonesia at the moment. Here in Australia, with our recent lockdowns, we're keenly aware of the challenges of preventing the spread of the Delta strain. We want to wish all those suffering from the virus a swift recovery. And we also express our admiration for medical workers who are on the front lines at this very difficult time. Look, this report is really an effort to inject some fresh thinking into Australia-Indonesia economic relations and begin to turn our attention to some important trends and how they demand a shift in a way that we frame our economic relations. And I want to start out with value chains and why they're going to become more important. Value chains are essentially production networks which span multiple countries. They have revolutionized the production of single goods and have also become a major characteristic of international trade. They are already a trend in our neighborhood right here in the Indo-Pacific region. On top of that, the advent of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, will unfetter the development of Indo-Pacific value chains. Once ratified, RCEP will solve some critical problems for firms using value chains in our region. First, it straightens out and harmonizes the so-called noodle bowl of overlapping ASEAN +1 trade agreements into a single set of trade rules for the Indo-Pacific. RCEP addresses complicated trade problems, such as where a specific good can be said to originate from, and whether or not it is eligible for the preferences of an existing trade agreement. Value chains often muddy this process, but RCEP simplifies the issue by establishing a region-wide certificate of origin system. What does this mean? Australian and Indonesian goods and those manufactured within a bilateral value chain will be able to move across the RCEP block and qualify for its preferences at each stage of the value chain. From this perspective, RCEP is an incredibly important component of the economic architecture for Australia and Indonesia trade ties, and that it will enable them to better work together as partners in emerging value chains. Now, this kind of partnership is known as powerhousing. This is a concept that was pioneered during negotiations of the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, or IA-CEPA, which were contemporaneous to those of RCEP. And a quick shout out to one of our guests on this call, Iman Pambagio, who is the former Director General for Trade Negotiations with Indonesia's Trade Ministry at that time. I understand he was instrumental in the development of this fundamentally value chain oriented concept. Now this brings me to IA-CEPA. IA-CEPA gives both countries an even stronger link to work together in this context. IA-CEPA goes further than RCEP in a couple areas. For one, it includes an investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, or ISDS, which helps businesses mitigate the risk of investing in a foreign legal jurisdiction, giving them more confidence to make investments in each other's economies that are value chain oriented. It also includes increased market access in Indonesia for many of Australia's agriculture exports. These are expanded through IA-CEPA's tariff rate quotas, or TRQ instruments. So the new approach to bilateral economic ties is a focus on value chain creation using the combined instruments of IA-CEPA and RCEP. I want to briefly discuss two sectors where expanded value chain cooperation can really boost Australia-Indonesia economic ties. The first is in agriculture. Now, following the value chain trend, the production of food and other agricultural products is no longer concentrated in just one country, but across many. Even primary products such as grains and live animals are exported for value-added stages in other countries. An existing example involving both countries is the wheat value chain. This produces everyone's favorite Indonesian brand of noodles, Indomie. And I'm going to share my screen for a brief moment. Now you can see here, this is the value chain mapped out. Wheat is grown and harvested in Australia. It's exported to Indonesia for value-added stages, milling, manufacturing into noodles or baked goods. And then it is shipped to third-party countries. I think this is a really good example of how other agricultural value chains can develop by starting with a simple Indonesia-Australia partnership and cooperation. I think this could be expanded to include other products, including grains like oats and barley, or other products such as citrus as well. So I think this is a good starting point for value chain development. Now, the second is an emerging opportunity that is in its early days of development, and that is the electric vehicle battery value chain. Both Australia and Indonesia are taking significant policy steps to participate in this cutting-edge industry. I want to briefly outline an argument that Australia is Indonesia's ideal partner to supply key minerals used in battery manufacturing. While Indonesia is the leading producer of nickel, Australia leads in the production of many other battery minerals, including lithium, cobalt, rare earths, and vanadium. Australia accounts for 60% of world production of lithium, a mineral missing from Indonesia's own domestic resource endowment. Australia is also a partner for developing technical capabilities. Indonesia is going to need to reorient its nickel mining and refining industry from a focus on stainless steel production to refining the nickel sulfate needed for lithium-ion batteries. Moreover, economic cooperation in areas like this is also enshrined in their bilateral, comprehensive strategic partnership. So basis of trust exists for working closer together in this sector. We know that Australia's proximity to Indonesia counts more than ever, especially when we're looking to establish secure and resilient supply chains. And finally, IA-CEPA in particular is a liberalizing tool allowing for the tariff-free movement of goods related to battery manufacturing. Their joint manufacturers will then be eligible to qualify as regional goods under RCEP's rules of origin and will move with less restriction to potential markets such as China, South Korea, and Japan. Now that's it for me, and I hope we can dig into some of this more in the question and answer session. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Kyle. And I'll now pass over to Brian, who will talk about some of the policy recommendations that have been made in this analysis and will be coming forth from the report. Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, excellent. And Jeff, if you don't mind, I'll zoom in slightly on digital economy and education as well to kind of zoom into those sectors to augment the aspects of the report that Kyle hasn't touched on. So yeah, essentially the key policy recommendations coming out of the digital economy section is that both Kyle and I strongly believe that IA-CEPA and RCEP put Indonesia and Australia in a really well-positioned spot to collaborate business to business over the internet. So both countries, I think, stand to gain a lot from each other's comparative advantages regarding the internet and can leverage each other to on-sell to third-party markets. So not just thinking about this as a bilateral exchange, but how they can support each other to go beyond their borders. As you know, both countries have incredibly large digital economies. Indonesia's has been growing a lot faster than Australia's, but both are comparable. But the makeup and the composition of those digital economies is quite different. As it turns out, the sort of strengths and the weaknesses align really, really well, where Australia needs access to large markets and large pools of skilled but affordable digital workforce, where Indonesia needs access to high-skilled sort of startup expertise that can really supercharge and continue to hit that growth that they need. They're growing at remarkable rates, around 40% year on year. So you can see that there's a lot of kind of natural complements between the two that can help bolster these digital economies, not just to sell to each other, but onto the region and the world. If I turn now to the education sector, this is kind of an interesting sort of add-on. At first, we thought about this as one of the ways that the countries can bolster each other's digital economies is through education and sort of upskilling from a technology perspective. But then we realized that this is actually kind of a standalone point all to itself, and that Indonesia and Australia have a whole lot to gain from each other from an education perspective. Now, of course, this is a little bit more intuitive from a bilateral trade perspective, thinking about just basic supply and demand, where Australia has a huge supply of very impressive higher education, and Indonesia is in incredible need for more improved higher education and just more access to higher education, particularly around vocational and educational training in the tertiary sector. So it's a really natural complement to each other. So that, I think that's quite intuitive to all of us. And I'm really excited for Alicia to explain a little bit more about the Monash case study, where Monash really is the vanguard of Australian universities extending into Indonesia and taking advantage of IA-CEPA to set up a campus in Indonesia. We're really hopeful that this is going to be a pattern that more Australian universities will follow, particularly as COVID-19 has really weakened their ability to attract students from the region into Australia. They're really trying to reimagine a new business model here, where they actually are going out to market and setting up in market rather than drawing students here. This is very unusual, particularly for vocational and educational training, which is usually all conducted by Indonesian universities in Indonesia, and never something that foreign universities come in and help facilitate. But as we all know, Joko Widodo has set incredibly ambitious targets for upskilling Indonesia's workforce, particularly around vocational and education, vocational and technical training. So Australia stands to facilitate that quite a lot. And then about kind of the regional aspect beyond the bilateral aspect of education, this is a little bit less tangible than the digital economy regionalization, but essentially Australia stands a lot to gain from an upskilled Indonesia. So the more that Australia provides higher education training and education into Indonesia, essentially the better trading partner for regionalization Australia has just to its north. So then what Kyle was talking about becomes more relevant, because you've got that more robust economy that's happening up there that Australia can take advantage of. And for Indonesia, of course, there's regional benefits as well. By strengthening its higher education industry, by leveraging Australia's strengths, Indonesia will become more of what it imagined in the ASEAN economic community of being one of the main regional players for higher education in ASEAN and beyond. So Indonesia will be able to attract others from around the region. I think I'll leave it at that, Jeffrey. I'm really looking forward to getting into these points in a lot more detail during the discussion session.
Thank you so much, Brian and Kyle, for that. Now, there's some really interesting ideas in here about reimagining this, and this is a big good opportunity to bring Alicia Solisto into the discussion. I mean, Alicia, you work at the coalface of actually putting the precise kind of deals together that we're talking about here in Singapore at the moment, physically in Singapore at the moment. But, you know, we'd really appreciate your perspective on how these ideas might trickle down into the commercial activity around trade, investment, even services and knowledge when we start talking about some of these education cases, and how from your position on the ground would this kind of project be able to be taken forward? Thanks, Alicia.
Thank you, Jeffrey. First of all, I'm actually based in Jakarta, so really in the coalface of where these deals are being made. Congratulations again to Kyle and Brian onto this report. I actually found it extremely insightful and timely. I completely agree that IA-CEPA specifically has been a great door opener for Australian investment into Indonesia. And as you mentioned, Brian, right, one investment which I think definitely capitalized on the IA-CEPA was Monash University, which you focused on in your report. As we know, IA-CEPA removed decades-long restrictions of foreign investment into higher education in Indonesia, which paved the way for Australian universities such as Monash to seize on the opportunity to become the first fully foreign-owned university to operate in Indonesia. Now, the liberalization, I think, was also very timely, as Indonesia was desperate to improve the quality of its human capital, especially in the face of a looming demographic bonus. And one of the biggest concerns cited by almost all employers in Indonesia is the giant skills gap between what's expected and what university graduates from Indonesia actually possess. So though Indonesian universities produce obviously excellent engineers, lawyers, doctors, and many other professionals, soft skills such as leadership, collaboration, consensus building, critical thinking were actually cited as very rare. So this is how the presence of Monash University and other top Australian universities is expected to help rectify this problem. However, despite universally being lauded as a great idea, Monash's establishment in Indonesia was not without its own challenges. The question then becomes, after IA-CEPA, what does it take for a hypothetically great idea to become a reality? Now, despite President Jokowi announcing to the Australian Parliament back in February 2020 that Monash University will become the first foreign campus to ever open its doors in Indonesia, your report itself says it won't start operations until sometime this year. So aside from the obvious logistical challenges presented by the pandemic, where are the gaps between a high-profile presidential announcement and securing the actual approvals required to start operations? For any company looking to enter Indonesia, I think Monash's case serves as a reality check that high-level support, even from the president, is not an all-encompassing key that unlocks doors to secure necessary government approvals. The differing interpretations between bureaucrats on a pioneer investment such as Monash still served as a major hurdle. Now, what this means, I think, is companies, universities, or any investor needs to make significant investment of time and effort to work together with government to make their investment happen. Be it, in Monash's case, maybe setting academic standards, which government of Indonesia never thought of before, shaping a favorable regulatory environment, or simply raising operational issues faced by pioneer investments such as the first foreign university in establishing a branch campus. And I think these exercises are all part of a process that builds a foundation for Indonesia to be able to capture future investments into these types of pioneer sectors, building off free trade agreements such as IA-CEPA and RCEP. I think what Monash's case has taught us is, despite the initial challenges, government was ultimately willing to meet investors halfway, maybe even more than halfway. And with the passage of the Omnibus Law, the establishment of the Ministry Investment, elimination of the notorious negative investment list, I think government of Indonesia is actually primed to listen to investor concerns and, more importantly, to make deals. And I think there's no better time to capitalize on that than right now. I think those are sort of my 2 cents, Jeffrey, and I'll leave the rest to the question and answers. Thank you, and over to you, Jeffrey.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Alicia, for those thoughts. And that's a really fascinating case study about how, how one can translate some of these opportunities that you get when you reimagine what the framework of action is into actually doing this on the ground. It's often a lot more complex than, sometimes us in think tanks make out. What I'd like to do now is to move into an opportunity to have a bit of a panel discussion where we can tease out some of these key ideas. And while there's some downsides to lockdowns and coronavirus and that we can't meet all together in the same room, one of the upsides is that with these registrations, we can take questions from our audience during the registration process, so we can really have a well-structured discussion session. I'd like to start with a question for Kyle, and this one comes to us from Iman Pambagio, who is a former Director General for Trade Negotiations at the Indonesian Ministry of Trade. And Pak Iman asks, in an era of coronavirus, and particularly the economic agendas that has changed and how that has made countries reset what their priorities are going to have to be in terms of economic policy, How can agreements like IA-CEPA and RCEP help Australia and Indonesia accelerate their economic recovery, specifically their COVID economic recovery, through some of these partnership models?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff, and thank you, Pak Iman, for that question. Look, I'll start out by saying that I think right now, COVID-19 is the biggest barrier to Australia-Indonesia trade and investment. It's really unfortunate that at this time that we have a wholly new toolkit to improve our investment and trade ties, that boom, right over it, we've got a pandemic, we can't travel, and it's a very, very challenging situation to implement new trade agreements in. Governments are distracted. They're focused on other policy priorities. They've got to roll out vaccines. They've got to support their medical community and public health care. So it's a really difficult time to be implementing new trade agreements like IA-CEPA and ones that are large and sweeping like RCEP. But if I were to drill down a little bit more, I think if once things settle and we're able to implement things, one of the things I'd focus on from an Australia-Indonesia perspective is their agriculture partnership. Two reasons. One, I think it will really help Indonesia's economic recovery to be able to stabilize food prices in the country, to make food more affordable. And again, Australia is close. It's a very productive agricultural society. We need to activate that ag partnership. The second reason is Australian farmers need an economic boost. As Jeff will no doubt support me in saying, this has been a tough 18 months for Australian farmers. Their products, particularly barley, have had suffered from economic sanctions from China, and supply chain, world's agricultural supply chains have been put under pressure. It's been a really, really tough 18 months for regional Australia. So I think that's a good starting point that really links to countries that are facing different difficulties and really activates IA-CEPA.
Excellent, thanks, Carl. Moving on from some of the points you picked up in that, particularly your comments around agriculture, I'm going to move to Alicia now. And for Alicia, I have a question from Dan Heldon, who's the Director in the Indonesia Trade and Economics section at the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Dan points out that Indonesia often uses Australian raw materials to produce a lot of the food and other manufactured products that it sells both domestically within Indonesia and around the world. Indeed, Kyle's example from some of the food value chains he used in his presentation really instantiates how that works. But Dan also notes that there sometimes is a sensitivity in Indonesia to the fact that there's a goods trade imbalance between Indonesia and Australia. What does the trade surplus versus trade deficit look like? And how does that frame thinking about who's winning and losing, to use those terms, in the relationship? So the question's interested in how the policy leaders in Australia and Indonesia, how could they flip that narrative to recognise the virtue of these economic powerhouse value chains beyond a way of thinking and measuring them that just looks at a bilateral balance?
Right. Thanks for that question, Jeff. I think it's very interesting. And, I think the sensitivities about trade imbalances isn't just surrounding goods, right? Services, I think, is also a very sensitive topic. So I'd actually like to use the Monash case as an example as well on how to flip this narrative, because I think it's very concrete. So, having other investments like an Australian university enter Indonesia is a great start, because thousands of Indonesians spend money in Australia annually seeking for higher quality education. But by allowing the import of services, be it education or VT or others, it actually doesn't threaten the ability of local service providers to compete. It actually prevents capital flight from Indonesians. So from Indonesians spending their money abroad for similar services, right? So investments in healthcare, for example, would also be another example. Having Australian hospitals being able to invest in Indonesia would prevent Indonesians from having to go to Singapore, to Thailand, other medical tourism destinations in the region, and again, prevent capital flight. So I think it's not just a matter of changing the narrative, but to take real action and direct investments which would actually create concrete value chains. Because I think together with Australia in the long term, it can position Indonesia as an export-oriented market as well, not just for goods, but also for services, being in education, healthcare, other sectors. So I think that would be my response, Jeff. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Alicia. That's a very interesting way to think about it. And it reminds me of old arguments about bringing in foreign investment to generate exports as well. We used to hear back in the 1980s when Indonesia first opened to foreign investment as well. So it's interesting you're using the education case study and with a link to healthcare, because the next question I've got is going to go to Brian. We've actually got two that are slightly related that I'd like to package up, Brian, and help that you could talk us through some of the details here. One comes from Tim Martin, who's the Trade Commissioner for Indonesia in Austrade. And Tim asks what role that VET and skills-based training, so not universities, but what we call in Australia TAFE, can that have in this new model of economic engagement, both directly and indirectly? And our other education question comes from Aidan Storer, who's the State Director for the Australian Commonwealth Treasury here in Western Australia. Aidan draws attention to the fact that there is an opportunity for Australian tertiary institutions to develop a commercial presence in Indonesia, but always asks a good economist question about the competition and says, are there any other countries' institutions that are also looking at Indonesia? And does that mean that there is a competitive pressure or a window of opportunity that Australia might need to be mindful of in picking up some of these education opportunities that we've discussed so far? Thanks, Brian.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeffrey. I'll start with Aidan's question regarding competition. I think that's a really interesting one, and one that Australian universities, of course, should be considering if they are looking to follow Monash. So the long and short of it is, yes, there will be competition, and it will probably be stiff. I used to work in the United States for USINDO, part of a government-funded program that was looking at higher education, building higher education ties between the United States and Indonesia. And so I'm very sure that the Americans are watching and probably watching quite jealously at Australia's success in Indonesia's higher education system. So they will be looking very closely at ways to potentially leapfrog the success that Australia has had attracting so many Indonesian students. So as we reimagine what that educational relationship might look like, of course, the Americans will be innovating and looking. Other countries as well will be looking to take advantage of Indonesia's 260 million people and extreme needs for education from the government all the way down. So that's a long-winded way to say yes, there will be competition. Moving to TAFE, I think this is where things get really interesting. Australia has one of the most advanced and successful TAFEs systems in the world, really, really well funded, very successful. And Indonesia needs access to this type of education and training. And we're right across the way, right? So it's a little bit about reimagining of just kind of attracting the cream of the crop, which has been Australia's universities' method to date, which is where you try to bring in the best English speakers, the best and the brightest, the ones that can just pay their way through, and they all come here and everything's easy and done. Instead, what needs to happen is reimagining where we're able to provide these types of skills training in market. So whether that's done over the internet to kind of tap back into our digital economy section. Maybe it's done virtually, it's done through online digital courses, it's done through collaboration or partnership with Indonesian universities. Sorry, my dog's about. I think I'll hand it back to you, Jeffrey. The Basset Hound says, I have said enough.
Oh, never work with children or animals, Brian. Thanks so much for that. Now, well, look, we've had a really interesting discussion regarding some of the services and more technology-based things, but there is particularly always a pullback towards the physical and the steel and concrete. And my next question is from Alicia, comes from a long-time friend of the Perth USAsia Centre, Jonathan Block, who's the leads resource energy and infrastructure work for ANZ Bank here. And I think most of the people on this call would be familiar with the scale and nature of the infrastructure challenge facing Indonesia, both as an archipelago, but also with its high-speed industrialisation and urbanisation. And Jonathan draws attention to the significant scale of project and infrastructure capital that has in recent years started to be invested in Indonesia from Chinese sources, very often state-owned banks, under its Belt and Road Initiative program. So his question is how and where could Australia and perhaps other partners such as the US or Japan be able to play in that space given the recent Chinese infrastructure presence in Indonesia? And related to that, particularly given the high politics of infrastructure projects, is how could Australia best influence and develop effective traction with senior leaders in Indonesia, including the president, over some of these major infrastructure projects?
Thank you, Jeff. Again, a very interesting question. I think, there's a lot of lessons actually to be learned from China's very aggressive Belt and Road Initiative, right? I think what the Chinese have done really well is emphasize in their pitches to the government, front and center, what does this investment mean for Indonesia? What's in it for Indonesia? So for example, if you come in and pitch an investment that's for the greater good of the environment or for the climate, it will very likely not resonate with the government. I think the messaging needs to be a lot more explicit on what benefits will the investment generate for Indonesia. How many jobs will it produce? How will it grow a certain province's or region's economy? How will it position Indonesia as an export producer? And as I said, Indonesia is very much in a deal-making mode right now, especially after government feels it's done all it can to attract investment. The Omnibus Law, the Ministry of Investment, the list goes on, right? And after they've laid these foundations, they're seeking to make investments happen. They want to know actually what investors' problems are. But bear in mind, I think issues that are brought to the government need to be very actionable and specific. So coming to government and raising an issue about, say, legal certainty around contracts, it's actually quite a long-term problem, right? And it would take, obviously it won't be resolved in a few weeks. So they're looking for stuff like permits they can issue or exemptions to a regulation they can grant. I think that's exactly the level of detail that they're expecting from investors when they bring something to the table. So I think that's one way to gain traction.
Thanks so much, Alicia. That's really interesting. Connected to the infrastructure question are questions about sustainability. And my next one is going to go to Brian, and it comes from a longtime friend of the Perth USAsia Centre, Larissa Taylor, who's a director at Saviour Consulting and has been significantly involved in the Australian agriculture industry. But hers is about decarbonisation. And Brian, Larissa would like to know, across these different supply chains we're looking at in Indonesia, which are the ones that are leading the decarbonisation process the fastest? And connected to that, what does that differential pattern of decarbonisation mean for how Australia might triage opportunities or approach prioritisation in trying to launch this agenda?
Thanks. It's a really interesting and really important question as well. as we consider regionalization, what are some of the value chains here that are going to help the decarbonization agenda that is so important? So, I'll just start by saying both countries are lagging quite a lot in terms of their decarbonization agenda from a top-down perspective in terms of regulations. Both have very strong fossil fuel industries that have a strong hold over the policy frameworks in both countries. So the supply chains and the industries that we're looking at here are not supercharged by a really conducive regulatory environment in either country. So then we're kind of looking between the cracks to see where the market itself is posting opportunities for a decarbonizing supply chains. And I think Kyle touched on one already that is potentially the most promising, and that's the lithium supply chain. Australia has a lot of it. Indonesia has a lot of manufacturing potential, and batteries are an absolutely essential component of the decarbonization agenda globally. There's really nothing that we're going to need more as we transition away from gas and coal-fired electricity. So I would highly recommend we prioritize that and look as much as possible into the lithium. Another one that is worth considering is the challenges in the solar industry, and that's both from a production and distribution, but also of raw materials. The world needs more polysilicon to make more solar. So looking, across the supply chains in the whole region to find where we can get access to ethical and sustainable polysilicon that's not being processed or refined by coal is really important. And then how do we integrate that into the value chain and get that out into places where there's a whole lot of sun, like in Australia. So there's a lot of interesting ways to think about the sustainability supply chains when you think about things more than just a bilateral kind of one country to one country, but really as a regional supply chain. It starts to get really interesting.
I can jump in on that real quick too, Jeff. Just a couple quick thoughts. I think the battery value chain also needs to kind of go under some decarbonization itself.
Yes.
Look, someone mentioned that the rotating kiln electric furnaces that refine nickel are incredibly energy intensive. There's a new nickel mining and refining facility being built in Halmahera, and I think they have to support that industry with coal-fired power plants to even be able to process the nickel right there on Weda Bay. So there's a big problem there. I know that even if you roll out electric vehicles in Indonesia, as things stand right now, over 60% of Indonesia's electricity grid is run through by coal plants. So there's a lot of work to be done on this front, and we're very, very early days in solving many of these problems.
Thanks, Kyle. Look, this has been a fascinating discussion, but one of the few joys of delivering events like this in the coronavirus era is that we can also have live questions from the audience. And several of you have written in with some, which we have here at my sidebar. We've got a great number, and so that tells me it's been a really engaged audience. And I may not be able to get through them all, but let me do a couple, and I'll put these out to you as panelists, and hopefully you could just give me some very quick and sharp responses so we can get a few different views. The first one I think we should go through is from Robin McClellan. It's about investment and bureaucracy. So Robin asks that and suggests that one of the big barriers to investment between Australia and Indonesia is the presumption in both sides that the other country's approval process for investment, particularly some of the complex things like services that you've been talking about, Alicia, are too bureaucratic, inefficient, and unwieldy. Whether or not that assumption is valid, it's certainly an assumption, and we've heard that from people in the business community on both sides as well. It's too hard. Given that perception, is there anything concrete and, in the realistic art of the possible that could be done on both sides to address that? maybe a one-stop shop, some kind of assistance entity, just some myth busting around the difficulty of those investments. I'll throw it open to the floor. I might go to Alicia first because this is your day job, so I think you'll be able to say get to it the quickest.
Thanks, Jeff. Look, I think the presence of offices like the Indonesia Investment Promotion Center in Sydney is, aimed exactly at sort of debunking these myths, right? But I think there won't be a better example than learning from your fellow Australians who have made it first, right? So I think it's no mystery that it does take a lot of time and commitment. Yes, absolutely. But when you see that there are Australian companies who are able to prevail and create very sustainable investments in Indonesia, that it's possible, right? And so I think having maybe a dialogue between a dialogue of companies who have already invested in Indonesia. I know there's the Australian Indonesia Business Council, for example, and the IA-BC as well. And make that actually sort of a persistent topic, right? Share very practical tips, even about how to overcome bureaucratic hurdles, for example. So, yeah, sorry, Brian, I think you wanted to add as well.
Right. So just speaking practically and zooming in on the digital economy section, there is a whole bunch that can very quickly and very practically be done between Australia and Indonesia using the infrastructure of each economy's digital economies. So, for example, Indonesia, there's all sorts of apps and services available for anyone in the world, but Australian companies can take advantage of this to access skilled tech labor, like graphic designers and data analysts. These people are available to be engaged and worked with from Australian organizations now that want to make themselves more competitive, more affordable, and go out to third-party markets and be and to continue to expand. So Australian organizations should leverage Indonesia's giant and affordable skill pool that's right there. Conversely, Indonesia can very practically benefit from Australia by hiring Australians on temporary or full-term contracts and just employing them across the internet. Indonesia has done a lot of deregulation already to try to attract foreign workers into startups, paving the way for foreign workers to access particularly tech startups. Similarly, the exclusive economic zones in Indonesia are being opened up as well for, again, tech startups. So Australia can take advantage of that. So there's a few ways using the digital economy that we could start benefiting each other right now.
Yeah, I can jump in real quick on this as well, Jeff. Thanks. Just one controversial thing really quick. I mean, I guess we got to think about, bureaucratic processes. I mean, compared to whom? I mean, Australian businesses are used to doing business in countries that are challenging, that have, different business practices. So I don't understand how Indonesia would be any more overwhelming or any more different. But that said, I do think there are improvements that need to be made. I think one thing that I've worked on when it comes to Australia's business partnerships with Vietnam is the importance of companies that are already there being guides for other companies. And it looks like, I think Alicia and Brian agree how key that is when you're kind of building increased bilateral trade and investment. So, and then from an Indonesian government perspective, yes, you get really, really groundbreaking presidential decrees, right? But they require implementation, follow-up regulations that need to be implemented by different ministries, and it can get quite confusing. So, and that's just going to take some bureaucratic reform in Indonesia to actually solve. But just some thoughts there. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone. I'm conscious that we're running down towards the time. There is one last question that I'd like to pose to the whole panel and get you to give me a 1 or 2 minute response to kind of tie some of these things together. And the question comes from Carlos Mangasong, who's the Senior Economist for Trade and Budget Policy in Prospero. And Pat Carlos asks us, how can we be sure that we've selected the right powerhouse collaboration in some of these areas? I guess another way to put that question would be to think about where does these combinations that we've been talking about between Australia and Indonesia sit in a comparative context? In a time of coronavirus dislocations, of collapsing global trade and investment flows as a result of that, the pie is smaller than it's ever been, and one has to command and really create an opportunity to command attention for that. So I guess I would be interested in your three, quickest marketing makeover statements, so to speak, as to what is it that makes this a real opportunity that's worthy of attention in straitened times. I think I'll start with Kyle and work backwards. So we'll go Kyle, Brian, Alicia.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Look, I really think this emerging battery value chain makes a lot of sense for Australia and Indonesia. I really hope more bilateral conversations begin about this. I don't really think Indonesia has Australia on its radar as a partner yet. So I think we need to do some work on that front and really make the case to Indonesia, hey, we can help you with this. We can support you with this. This is the capabilities that we have, and this is where our policies align. I really do see a really good alignment of policy in this case. Other stuff in the future, I mean, I really hope there's some new opportunities that emerge in agriculture, particularly as Indonesia's middle class and their demand for certain goods and food products change. As well, I think there'll be opportunities there. And I think once we get through COVID-19, hopefully it's a bright future, and there's a lot of other opportunities we can identify as well.
Brian.
Yeah, to be quite simple, I mean, Kyle and I thought a lot about this paper and what sort of complementary supply chains we wanted to focus in on and write about, but by no means did we find them all. There are so many more opportunities for regional powerhousing out there than the ones we identified in this report. We wanted to just give a flavor for what thinking more regionally could be like, and what some of the industries that we identified through our research and through our experience were. So yeah, by no means are we trying to say that this is it. And I think as long as you think about it in terms of, I'm Indonesia, and I want to tap into global supply chains and be more competitive. Let's think of my resources that I have available to do that. But rather than just thinking about Indonesia's resources, stretch that out across IA-CEPA and into Australia and say, what sort of competitive advantages do we have as a grouping, rather than just as an individual country, that can make us more competitive when we go out into global supply chains to compete. And Australia needs to think the same thing.
That's excellent. And coming up to the end of the hour, I'll throw to you, to Alicia, for what will almost be the last word. Thanks.
That's a lot of pressure. Thanks, Jeff. But I think in terms of your question about how do we know we're actually choosing the right powerhouse, I hope that this will open up what will become a free movement of people, free movement of ideas, and between Australia and Indonesia, because I truly believe that all this will then have an impact on sectors that will be imperative for the economic recovery of Indonesia and the region as well. So you're talking about, if you have free movement of doctors, into Indonesia, that will propel healthcare. If you have free movement of students, propel education, right? Tourism, obviously, and the digital economy as well, because you need engineers who can be able to work, you know, from anywhere in the world, but in Indonesia as well, to transfer that knowledge, right? And so I think this, you know, RCEP and IA-CEPA will definitely play a huge hand in that. Thanks, Jeff.
Oh, excellent. Thanks so much, Alicia. And thanks everyone for this. Now, this has been really fascinating for me. I've spent most of my career working in issues around trade and investment development, particularly for Australia into markets in the region. And I think it's fair to say that there is a bit of a default view as to how you do this, is that you look at your country, you look at what you guys make, you get told the partner, you look at what they might buy, and you try and like get those two columns in the spreadsheet. Where do they line up? Okay, we'll do that. You know, that widget to that market. And what I think is really interesting about the kind of discussion we're having now is it really breaks out of that intellectual box of what is it that Australia's got we can sell to Indonesia or vice versa. And it moves out of a transactional mode. It moves out of a goods focused mode. So we're now talking about services and education, and it really puts that in the region. You know, some people in the comments have pointed out that the powerhouse idea is not new, and it's certainly not. But equally, we also aren't seeing it happen nearly as much as it could be, apart from some of the examples that Ryan and Kyle have given us in the report. So I think this is really a way beyond Australia and Indonesia to actually think about how some of these regional engagement questions can be digested in the future. And I found it really fascinating and useful for my own interest as well. I have to apologise that we've had really great audience engagement. There might be almost 20 questions in the discussion box, and we have run out of time. So my deepest apologies to everyone I haven't been able to get to. But this is always an ongoing conversation and dialogue. So I'm sure Brian and Kyle would love to hear you if you have ideas, suggestions, criticisms, things that we could take on in the future. Please get in touch with us. You can find all our contact details on the website, as you can find the Beyond the Bilateral report, which is now up and live. Other than that, look, I really appreciate everyone who's taken the time to join us this afternoon. This has been a real pleasure for all of us. From Brian, Kyle and Alicia, I really look forward to seeing you at a Perth USAsia Centre event online in the future, and hopefully one day in person as well. So thanks for coming, and hope you have a great evening.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Thanks, everyone.
Terima kasih.